is Not Sam Wrestling.
Introducing your host from New York, here is Sam Roberts.
And as previously stated, this week here on Not Sam Wrestling, one of my favorite people to talk wrestling with, Wade Keller, is back for the first time in a while. What's going on, man?
Not too much. Just kind of, in the midst of shifting to holiday weekend and all the work I'm going to do on my holiday weekend and how it's going to be a little different than normal, scheduling wise. I never stop working, but it's a different mindset this week after a crazy week or two in pro wrestling.
It really is, and since it's Thanksgiving week, and we're celebrating Thanksgiving for all the North American fans here on the show this week, I thought this would be a good time to celebrate the fact that we're thankful for wrestling. That's what we're talking about, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So Survivor Series went down on Sunday. First of all, what did you think about Survivor Series? Not necessarily just as a pay-per-view in 2018, but almost from a historical context. Like, I feel like Survivor Series is only starting to kind of get back to a place where it's considered one of the big five, I guess, with Money in the Bank included as well. Because for a while, it kind of started to get pushed to the back end. But for a long time, Survivor Series was one of the big pay-per-views of the year. How do you think this year added to that legacy or detracted from that legacy? Where do you think Survivor Series stands right now, and how do you think it compared to years past?
Yeah, it's interesting because it was, originally created to kind of snuff out Jim Crockett Jr.'s attempt to launch Starrcade nationally as a Thanksgiving pay-per-view. And so it started as sort of like, well, we don't want to give anything too big away that's going to hurt house show attendance, which is so weird because that's not their mentality now.
Yeah.
So we're just going to throw a bunch of wrestlers in tag teams and package this event with WrestleMania so that cable companies who have limited pay-per-view clearances choose us instead of Jim Crockett. And it was, one of the big reasons Crockett ended up selling to Turner because it was devastating to not get in the pay-per-view game the way that they wanted to. So when you look at the roots of Survivor Series, the tag team idea wasn't created because they thought it would be this great idea that's going to draw a lot of pay-per-view buys. It was, how can we create a pay-per-view that won't disrupt other storylines? And get in the way of house show attendance and what we have planned for other big events coming up. And then it went through a phase where because of that tradition, it was seen as one of the big four. And then it went through a stretch where it was seen as not all that important. The elimination tag matches lost some of the novelty and luster, and people knew, okay, it's SummerSlam, Rumble, WrestleMania, even King of the Ring for a while was kind of the summer event before Money in the Bank kind of made its mark. I think they've done a good job, even though there's aspects of it that I think are a little corny. The Raw SmackDown rivalry, which Shane McMahon completely ignored this week after saying it was the most important thing in the world last week.
Really, really weird that there was no reference to the fact that they lost in a clean sweep. I thought that would be a kind of a big storyline and almost make SmackDown into an underdog hero type of show, but they really just kind of didn't say anything about it.
Well, not only that, but Shane McMahon had said on Twitter, big change is coming. And the big change was just being too sore to tag in an impromptu tag match with Miz.
Yeah.
I mean, it was just that it was a weird episode of SmackDown. I think we have to wait till Tuesday to see how it shakes out. But they lost something there. But so it's a little weird when they make it seem like, Raw versus SmackDown and all the heels and baby faces set their grudges aside to fight for brand pride. But at the same time, what it's done is it has created a novel moment in the fall or winter, wherever we are, I never know, and where it's different. You know what I mean? Like, it stands out as different because it is a chance to see a match you would not see otherwise. The Raw champ versus SmackDown champ, both women and men. And then a bunch of people teaming together wouldn't normally team together, and a bunch of wrestlers wrestling each other who don't really wrestle each other and might not again for years. So in that sense, it's good. This year's Survivor Series, it just got blown up. I mean, the match, it was going to be a one-match show. Ronda and Becky, and the conversation and the feeling about this specific event's importance and place in history would be so different had that taken place. And instead, we got Charlotte and Ronda, but I don't get the feeling a few days out here that Charlotte Ronda turned out to be like this historically really significant match, like Becky was. I think that match Charlotte and Ronda deserved and needed more time to be built up. So that ended up being less than I think it could have been, but they had to do something. The Bryan Lesnar match, though, I think is what this show will be remembered for more so. And in that sense, it's historically significant. It was part of this 1 week evolution to Daniel Bryan's character in a big way, a transformation. So I think they're doing a good job making it one of the big annual pay-per-views, but I don't think anybody would still consider it as big as SummerSlam or WrestleMania or the Rumble, because it's Survivor Series still feels to me like a novelty pay-per-view that's a little outside of the normal narrative path.
I mean, even Money in the Bank has actual ramifications that are gonna, go in. It tells you going forward who are going to be some key players on Raw and SmackDown, which Survivor Series doesn't necessarily. You've been
and I'll throw in Survivor Series. The influence it has is letting fans know that Raw is still the A brand. That's That's the lasting impression.
I mean, by a mile, I guess, at this point. Yeah. So you've been the PW Torch started when?
1987.
Okay, so you've been covering Survivor Series since the beginning.
I've covered every single one of them. Yep. I remember, in fact, in 1987, just a few weeks after publishing my first newsletter while I was in college, having a choice between watching the Survivor Series on pay-per-view, going to I think it was the Orpheum in downtown Minneapolis to watch Starrcade on closed circuit, because Vince McMahon's predatory move to knock Jim Crockett's Starrcade off of pay-per-view led to Starrcade being on closed circuit instead in a lot of places, or go to the Minneapolis Auditorium just a few blocks away and watch Kurt Hennig against Greg Gagne for the AWA title headline one of the last even slightly relevant AWA shows, which is a territory that it was a major promotion that I grew up watching, the birth of Hulkamania and the Road Warriors there. The Road Warriors didn't start there, but they were from this area and were very big stars in the AWA in the 80s. And so that's kind of where my fandom started. So that was a big deal. I ended up going, well, there's one show I can see in person and the others I can watch later. So I went to the AWA show, but it was a tough choice. So yeah, it was a very big weekend for me, barely a month into publishing the newsletter, because there was so much to cover that weekend.
Yeah, and how do you watch the stuff later? Because it's not like you've got DVR in 1987.
Oh, exactly. It was just tapes. Like a friend who had a VHS tape could record Survivor Series, and then Starrcade, I actually had to have someone send me a tape of it who had pay-per-view access and a VHS. So I watched Starrcade like a week and a half later.
Wow. And it was all new. You didn't have to worry about like staying off Twitter for spoiler alerts at that point.
No. Well, I actually had to cover what happened in Starrcade in the newsletter, so I think I ended up knowing what happened in Starrcade before.
So as somebody who went to college, as somebody who went to journalism school, as somebody who knows what words mean, WWE for the longest time, and it might be since the very beginning, says sole survivors, no matter how many survivors there are. And it drives me absolutely crazy when there are two or more people and they say sole survivors. I go right to the movie Airheads. When I go, there's three of you. You're not exactly lone. Yeah, I'm right here, right? You can't have more than one sole survivor, right?
Yes.
Right. Okay, good.
I mean, I don't need to say anything more than yes.
Right.
You
okay.
are correct.
Yeah, that's right. I was
they
like,
need to find new words.
I'm going, am I the crazy one here? Why do they keep saying sole survivors? Do you have a favorite? So you've kind of, and it's really interesting talking to you because you have a different perspective on all of this, because where we've all watched for as long as we've watched for, you're one of the very few people that have the perspective of watching and covering this stuff and watching with the intent to cover it for this long, from the beginning of Survivor Series. So your experience is, I think, totally different than most people. Do you have a favorite Survivor Series that you've covered?
Oh man. I don't, nothing comes to mind. Like and that's part of the issue. I guess if you gave me a few options, I'd be like, oh yeah, that I remember that moment.
So then a better question, what did you think, as somebody who had covered Survivor Series, as somebody who got, like, Survivor Series was, before it was the one time of the year when Raw and SmackDown compete in head-to-head competition, it was teams of five strive to survive. And Survivor Series 91 was, of course, it was the first time there was ever a singles match on a Survivor Series show, and it was Undertaker versus Hulk Hogan. When WWE, and that was a pretty significant Survivor Series because not only was it the singles match, but at the last minute, which, I guess history would repeat itself, but at the last minute, they decided to change what was the biggest elimination tag match. And they turned it down from 4-on-4 to 3-on-3. They took Jake Roberts out, and I think Psycho Sid, or Sid Justice at the time, I think they took him out. And they shifted some of their energy into the Tuesday in Texas pay-per-view, which had yet to be announced. It would be announced at the beginning of that Survivor Series show. But what did you think in that moment, A, of the idea that WWE is now going to start incorporating singles matches into Survivor Series? And B, since we're talking about it, do you remember how you covered this idea that WWE, out of nowhere, is adding this Tuesday in Texas pay-per-view?
Yeah, it was controversial at the time because it felt... I remember how I felt in the theater with Back to the Future 2. And I'm like, wait a second. That's not an ending. That's a teaser. That's a trailer for Back to the Future 3. I think people felt that way about that. It felt a little bit like a money grab. We're not done charging you yet to see the end of what's happening. It was weird, but it was also kind of exciting, because it was something that hadn't been done before. It was an experiment for WWE that they did not repeat. And that tells you something about the fan reaction and whether it was successful. But the idea was, can we have promote on Monday Night Raw a pay-per-view for the next night and have a fast and use that kind of hook where we're not telling people 6 days later buy something, but the next day buy something. How will that pay off? I mean, it was controversial, but it was a time when WWF was experimenting with trying to figure out how, what the rules were and whether you could shake up the understood approach of how pay-per-views work and vary it up a little bit. They also they had the idea for Shotgun Saturday Night years later.
Yeah, totally.
A weekly pay-per-view on Saturday night in a nightclub atmosphere. It's going to be edgy, and it ended up just becoming a TV show because it just for a variety of reasons didn't work out. So yeah, I mean, it wasn't embraced, but it was sort of exciting and different. Like for me, it was like one more thing to cover before publishing deadline, and so that was kind of fun. But yeah, I mean, it's amazing how that was 27 years ago. Wow.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Especially because November of '91. You really didn't have a lot of schmozzy finishes to title matches where it was kind of incomplete. Like now we're kind of used to it because every month there's a pay-per-view and there's a follow-up on Raw and there's always going to be follow-up. But for the most part, leading up to that, a title match had a sense of finality when you paid for it on pay-per-view, right?
Yeah, you were expecting to see... it didn't always happen, but it was controversial when it didn't. There was an understanding, almost a unstated pact, that there's house shows and there's TV shows, and then at pay-per-view, you see title changes and conclusions to feuds or a major chapter in feuds. But, wrestling companies sometimes got in trouble by not following, not honoring that unstated pact with fans.
Right.
And it, it did hurt. Yeah, I mean, pay-per-view... it's crazy, but like in the early 90s, pay-per-views, there weren't organized fan conventions or fan fests or anything like that, but there was a group of us who traveled in the early 90s to the WCW pay-per-views in Baltimore and Philadelphia and outside of Detroit and try to think of the other place, Phoenix, for WCW pay-per-views. And we'd get together and coordinate, not through the internet, but through newsletters and announce, it's a hotel that you should get a room at, and we're just going to, hang out, because it was hard to find wrestling fans back then. It was pre-RSPW, pre-message boards. And so it was a way through newsletters for us to meet and get to know what people looked like and what they were like in person, because we knew each other's names through basically letters pages in the print copy newsletters back in the day. And so those early 90s conventions are really cool memories for me, because it's the only chance you had to ever get together with like-minded hardcore wrestling fans.
Was it at all stressful because you're sitting there going like, okay, you got this newsletter, PW Torch, and yeah, you got a subscription base, but when you're doing a convention now, because we have the internet, we know what to expect when we get there. When you're doing, and I know it's not a full-fledged convention, but even just a sort of like meet and greet, hangout, let's all go to the shows together, you don't really know how many people are going to show up to this thing, do you? Like, you don't know until you get there because you just put the word out in the newsletter and hope that it sticks, right?
True. I mean, I think we knew it would be in the dozens, in terms of like fans. I mean, it was almost like a secret society in the sense that you would get invited by people who were already in kind of the newsletter. I won't call it a clique, but the small group of people who communicated with each other and were hardcore fans and were tape traders and that kind of thing. They might bring a fan with them who wasn't a newsletter reader, wasn't quite that hardcore, or tell a few friends or something like that. But most of the people who showed up, we felt we knew just through typing up letters and sending them in the mail to each other or reading each other's opinions in the newsletters. So it was a relatively small group. But I mean, I created new readers who are still with me to this day by handing out free copies outside of Baltimore Arena. I would bring newsletters with me and stand outside on the perimeter of the arena grounds. And I was, this ambitious entrepreneur in his early 20s trying to spread the word to fans who didn't know that there was this source of inside information that they might have been craving and just didn't know existed. So it was a marketing opportunity to reach new people who then later ended up becoming kind of part of that circle of insider fans, so to speak.
So you guys were kind of like the Freemasons of wrestling. To be one, you must know one. Yes.
Yes.
So how do you? So is that really? Was that the spot to get business? Because I always just find it so fascinating. You're in college. It's 1987. You don't have the internet. You've got the people that you communicate with are just the people that you communicate with, if that makes sense. So you've got this idea to start this newsletter. You got a passion for wrestling. You like reporting. You want to be able to communicate about this stuff with other people. Nowadays, to go from idea to execution on just about anything, the internet's made it so simple. It's really amazing. It's revolutionized the idea of content creation. But then when you decide you want to do a newsletter, number one, how do you find sources, or at the time, was it not news-based? Was it more results-based? And number two, how do you spread the word to people in any sort of significant number that you've got this newsletter out there?
Yeah, great questions. It was definitely news-based. It was one of my early niches was interviews. And so there were not wrestlers in its, for newer fans today, it's unfathomable to not imagine being able to listen to wrestlers talk about the business in a conversational way. That was taboo. I mean, the quote kayfabe or protecting the inner workings and the way the business operated, it was still a big thing in the late 80s. And so it was a bit of a pioneering approach to take to try to get wrestlers to speak on the record. So besides the news aspect of it, which was, it was results, but it was also going to local indie shows, going to AWA shows, trying to establish contacts and getting information. And wrestlers wanted information to be spread. They're not everybody, but there were wrestlers, especially younger generation, who were like, they want the truth to be out there about what was going on behind the scenes, especially if they felt that unfair things were happening in terms of pay, in terms of schedule, in terms of politics. So it was their way to kind of get word out about the old guard and the new guard wanting to have an influence. And so, I mean, one of my first big interviews was Vern Gagne, who was very old school. I don't think he had any idea what he was getting himself into, based on at one point going, who are you again and who are you with? When I started asking questions about, controversies regarding Vern Gagne's promoting practices.
Because shoot interview isn't even a thing back then. So they probably think you're just some kid doing an interview for like a college newspaper that's going to promote the show.
And say, what's your favorite match? Who's your toughest opponent?
Right.
And so early on, I went against that. It was controversial when Chris Cruz, who was a WCW announcer under contract to WCW, did an interview with me and talked very frankly about the wrestling industry, the scene, the politics of announcing, all that stuff. He got heat for that.
And what year was that?
He was a former CNN anchor, and He was just like, I respect what Wade you're doing, and I want to interview Eddie Gilbert, Paul Heyman, Jim Cornette. Those were Mick Foley. Those are four of the really big new generation names who did long form on record interviews with me in the late 80s and then into the early 90s, mostly, and with most of those names, and hours of interviews with Heyman and Eddie and Cornette and Mick Foley. And their ideas and the way they looked at the business and the way they were willing to speak openly about it was a huge thing. So even when I would reach out to ask someone to do an interview, because then I just start networking. Can I have? Hey, I would start asking from people I know up for phone numbers, and I would cold call wrestlers. I mean, it's rude to think of that now. I don't even cold call my friends.
Yeah.
That's rude.
Yeah.
So I'm like, it must be an emergency or else you're pissing me off. Why are you calling me? Text me. But back then I would cold call wrestlers and go, hey, I'm Wade Keller. I do the Pro Wrestling Torch newsletter. Don't know if you heard of it, but we do interviews. I'd love to have a half hour of your time. And I would get interviews that way. Or they'd go, I don't want to do an interview, but can I tell you something off record? I know what you're doing. Like, so sources got created that way.
Wow. I mean, that's wild.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's amazing. Now, who were some of the people that you would call up and they'd go, no, I know what you're doing. Get the hell out of my face. You got to be out of your mind if you think that I'm going to contribute to this nonsense.
Oh, good question. It's funny. I got to say this. I had a good sense of who probably would not be receptive and probably was wise enough or steered away from calling them. Mm-hmm. That said, one of my strategies, I'll call it in retrospect, but it was had other purposes too. I would do summer annuals. I did year-end yearbooks, and then I did summer annuals. So besides the newsletter every week, I'd put together books, which I need to reissue one of these days. But they've been out of print for like 25 years. But I would do themes. So I'd have the summer annual, and I had the evolution of wrestling. And my goal was, with that, to talk to people who normally wouldn't think of talking to a dirt sheet or a newsletter. But I would say I would get one name who was an older legend and old school to agree, and then I'd use that to leverage getting more people to join. And so in the summer annuals, I did the evolution of wrestling, and I talked to Roy Shires and Lou Thez and Jerry Lawler, and so I'd talk to a bunch of old timers and get them to talk about what they had, and I wanted to learn. I mean, it wasn't like just a ruthless marketing strategy. I really wanted to learn. I wanted to talk to these older names. They hadn't talked at length about the business. There wasn't book writing. There weren't podcasts. So I saw it as an opportunity to get some insight from them and get it in print and on record for history. So that was a way that I approached people like Jerry Lawler, who then was very old school and would have said no. But I said, oh, but Jerry, I've got this guy and this guy and this guy, and I think you belong in the group with these legendary names. And Jerry's like, all right. And then it went well. And I did my homework, and I approached it in a way where then people were willing to talk to me and said, hey, this kid's serious about what he's doing. I'm going to respect his effort and persistence and good questions and do that. And I did a theme of announcing. So it was a big deal, but I got Jim Ross and Lance Russell. Ken Resnick, I think, was in that book. So I interviewed Mick Karsh, who was a AWA ring announcer and a longtime indie wrestling announcer. I got a bunch of announcers to do interviews with me because they didn't want to be left out of the announcer book. Because there's so little pro wrestling media.
Yeah.
So that's an approach that I took. And then that led, in some cases, to people who would be willing to talk to me or point me in the right direction to talk to other people, to develop sources and gather news. And then marketing-wise, wasn't just handing out issues, because I know you asked that too.
Yeah.
It was just handing out issues in front of arenas, but I did a lot of that, especially in hardcore WCW markets where WWF fans were different back then, and WCW fans were much more likely to be into the insider wrestling because it was Ric Flair and the Four Horsemen and the Midnight Express and Cornette, as opposed to it was sort of the enemy, the hardcore fan, then the WWF, which is Hulk Hogan and Undertaker. Oh my God, that's just a cartoon character. It's so different now. But I was the first one to take out full-page advertisements in the newsstand wrestling magazines, which was controversial even among insider fans, going, you can't open up that world to the marks. They can't handle this information. I got pushback even from people in my inner circle. But I did it, got good feedback, and grew that way. I took ads out, I don't know if I did it 100 times, but probably 50 times in sporting news. Took ads out in sporting news and got thousands of people to try the torch through doing that. And USA Today, multiple times I ran display ads in the sports section in USA Today. I did hockey news, a few other places, some regional newspapers. also. And so I expanded the readership in the newsletter in that way. And I was the first one to do any of that, to do any mainstream advertising of Insider Wrestling newsletters.
So when Meltzer really starts to gain the reputation as being like, he's doing TV appearances, he's doing this, and he's like this insider, do you start to, at the time, as a young man, feel competitive with him? Because like you said, there's very little wrestling media, right? There's a handful of wrestling newsletters, if that. At the end of the day, really it's only two sort of mainstream wrestling newsletters that have kind of survived the day. But it's not like there's all these websites and these podcasts and there's everything where it's like we're just kind of doing our thing. Like the amount of people that are doing newsletters and hitting a lot of people is only a few. So is there a camaraderie amongst newsletter writers, or is there a competition because you're both after the same audience?
Yeah, I would say more camaraderie, but also competition. Mm-hmm. When I started the Pro Wrestling Torch newsletter, it was because I discovered other wrestling newsletters were out there, because Wrestling Eye magazine, which is it's an answer to a trivia question, but Mike Bellew, who was the editor of Wrestling Eye magazine in the mid 80s, changed the course of my life and that of many others. And I don't know how, it's a butterfly effect type thing, but he had a fan club section in the back of Wrestling Eye magazine. And Wrestling Eye magazine had eclectic, I'll say in a complimentary way, mix of kayfabe and non-kayfabe articles in it. So in one page, you would have something that could be right out of these Stanley Weston or the After mags, or the ones George Napolitano edited and did photography for. And then the next page, there'd be an insider article, and it would, here's secrets about wrestling, 10 things you didn't know, and it would talk about wrestling matches being predetermined. Well, he in the back of the magazine had the fan club section, and it was for, predating Insider Wrestling newsletters. There were newsletters, but they were fanzines that were built largely around the top wrestler in a territory and a fan club, and people would follow the fan club. And they would subscribe, pay basically postage and printing. This is a term a lot of your listeners might not know. SASE was a big thing in the 80s, self-addressed
Yes,
envelope.
of course.
We don't hear that anymore, but sometimes you could get a free fan bulletin just by sending in an SASE to the fan club person, or you'd have to include $1, and they'd send you, a year's worth.
That's when you would literally, and I would do this when I was a kid to try to get autographs from different wrestling promotions. You would write a letter, and you would add an envelope with a stamp and your address on it that was not sealed, and then you would put that into a sealed envelope with a stamp and an address on it, so that way they don't have to pay for postage, they don't have to address it, you just make it easy for them. They put something in an envelope, and you see, sometimes nothing, sometimes a month later in your mailbox, there's something there.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So those fanzines or fan club bulletins created a network of fans, and that predated me doing the torch. Those were kind of fading away, and then the first newsletter I got in the mail was John Gallagher's Wrestling Forum, and it was based out of Illinois, but it was not to get too into it, but he folded the newsletter in half. It was like a booklet, but it was like 20 pages or 16 pages something, and I must have I think I got like 2 or 3 copies in 2 days that he sent to me when I first subscribed. And I don't know how many times I read those before, like over and over and over again. I was like, oh my God. It was a fast turnaround time on results. It was only a week and a half before I could find out what happened at Madison Square Garden, as opposed to 2 months through the newsstand magazines. And then I got the Observer in the mail. And then I got some other ones that were kind of more of the era of results zines from the early 80s and the fan club bulletins. But I just subscribed to everything in Wrestling Eye. And then the newsletters would plug each other. We knew that it was just a courtesy, kind of like we do with podcasting,
right?
It was just, hey, we're competitors, but we're also friendly. And how do people find you? I recommend you, and we all do that for each other in the newsletters. So there was sort of the big 3 in the late 80s: the Wrestling Observer, Pro Wrestling Torch, and Wrestling Forum. Mm-hmm. John Gallagher faded. Steve Beverly's Matt Watch came in, became one of the big 3, but then the others kind of were more niche oriented, I guess, and proud of it, but didn't grow or last. And so that's a medium nutshell of how that evolved.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. I've always, and we've kind of talked about it here and there without ever getting specific, but there's this idea that, wrestling promotions hate dirt sheets, wrestling promotions hate these websites, that and it's not a WWE, and all of them, that's the sort of idea. But there was a time when WWE was cooperating with you guys, right?
Yes, absolutely. It's been up and down. There was a time when Sally or Ed would call me from WWE headquarters every Monday morning, and if I was in the office, I'd pick up. If not, they'd leave a message, and they would tell me the exact attendance, the exact amount of money earned from ticket sales, and the exact amount of money earned from merchandise sales with the per head average. And they wanted that on record and in print because they got tired of seeing numbers that were wildly wrong.
Right.
And they weren't a publicly traded company, but for whatever reason, they wanted it out there. But this is the funny part. If I called them up 3 days later and said, hey, can you tell me the next time you're going to be in Chicago? They'd go, we can't release that information publicly. Like, it was crazy. They did not, because they felt like if future dates got published, other promoters would mess with it. And so they wanted to create a lot of footwork necessary in order to find out when their future dates were. So it's like one of those just weird little quirky things about wrestling history and when they would share information and not. You couldn't get anything out of WWE on an official level about anything coming up in the future. The only way you could know when a show was coming up, there was no website, there was no press releases through email or Twitter. You had to know someone who watched television in that market who would then send you a letter or call you and leave a message on your answering machine and say, hey, Wade, they announced the next time that they're going to be at the UIC Pavilion in Chicago is February 22nd. Like, that's the only way you could learn about that. So, yeah, they've been cooperative at times. I mean, there's been times Vince McMahon has called me just to complain about Ted Turner. Vince called me one time and demanded I do an on-record interview with him so he could vent. There are other times that I called and asked him for an interview, and this was actually years earlier, and he agreed to do a long-form interview with me, and then he asked for the questions ahead of time. And I said, well, I'll send you a list of topics I have in mind so you can think about them ahead of time, but I can't promise these are the only questions I ask. And it was through the PR person, and the PR person said, no, you have to tell us what questions are the only ones you can ask. And I said, I can't agree to those terms. I would never do that. And then it didn't happen.
I get that.
So I turned down a Vince McMahon interview, actually, at one point. But years later, we did one, and it was great. And so it's been various levels of friendliness and non-friendliness. Hey, Wade, come to WrestleMania. We've got a media section set up, or invites to shows, and other times, much less friendly. What
is that like for you? And this is something I've always wondered. The reason why I have for a long time, and we'll get into, because I've talked a lot about wrestling journalism and what I think of it and stuff.
You did once, didn't you?
Yes, I did. And I kind of have always tried to make you an exception, and that's part of the reason why we're talking, because the idea of finding sources and reporting news and all this stuff, like you're clearly coming off of a journalism degree and treating this like journalism, but I think we both kind of agreed that there's a lot more of the stuff that I was talking about that's not remotely journalism, which has nothing to do with you. All you can do is the best job that you can do. But the reason why I, from the beginning, was adamant about the fact that, I will not only will I never claim to be a journalist, I will never let anybody call me a journalist. I will never let that even sort of be an unsaid thing. Like, there is nothing about what I'm doing that I would consider any sort of journalism. I don't hold myself to journalism standards. I'm clearly a fan. You know what I mean? I clearly have a pro WWE bias. I clearly have relationships with some of these wrestlers that they're buddies, and it's like we're chatting or whatever. And and I'm more interested in doing that than being a reporter, which is why I feel like what I do is different and it's just totally different and has a different value than what you do. But because that's my perspective, when you go through these things where you've got a Vince McMahon who's calling you on the phone because he wants to vent, or you've got a Paul Heyman or a Mick Foley who very early in their careers are doing hours and hours of interviews with you and really confiding in you, does it become difficult for you to separate and realize these people aren't my friends, and this isn't the sort of thing where Vince McMahon and I are going to talk forever, or, Paul Heyman is going to go off and do something else now, and I'm not going to be able to get hours and hours of interviews from him whenever I want, because this isn't a friendship thing. This is a thing where I'm doing my job as a writer and as a journalist, and he's coming to me because I'm the person who disseminates information.
And not that it hasn't happened by accident. It certainly has. But I have never looked to wrestling for friendships, like people in the business.
Right.
And part of it is, I started at age 16 as a junior in high school. 2 years later, I was in journalism school. 3 years later, I'm interning at a top 20 TV station and hosting a weekly wrestling radio show on a 50,000 watt all sports station, the second of its kind in the country, I believe. I think WFAN was first, but KFAN came second. And I was around journalism and journalists. My journalism professor in my freshman year of college was an award-winning Vietnam reporter who did tremendous work. I had a very idealistic, pure version of what it meant to be a journalist, and was surrounded by it and immersed myself in it. And I knew from a very early age that I was more interested in being a journalist about something than involved in wrestling at any cost. I would be a journalist before I would be involved in wrestling. As much as I was a huge wrestling fan as a kid, and as much as it's been this huge part of my life, I think my course in life was going to be journalism. And it happened that I tied it to a hobby and then found a niche and then succeeded. So I didn't look to be involved in wrestling because I wanted to be friends with wrestlers or promoters. That's actually almost been a badge of honor from a very young idealistic mindset, that I wouldn't look to wrestling as my social circle. My social circle and friends were people who didn't like wrestling, or if they did, they were fans and not involved in the business. Mm-hmm. So I think to the main answer to your question is, it actually was more disappointing to people in wrestling. And I felt bad about it at times, where people thought I was their friend first and a journalist second.
I see.
And they felt betrayed. Eddie Gilbert felt betrayed by me at times. Mick Foley expressly has felt betrayed by me at times. Jim Cornette sent me death threats and said horrible racist things about my mother on phone messages because he felt betrayed by me. Paul Heyman handled things with more class than that, but he has felt betrayed. But Paul, actually, I got to give Paul credit, because Paul always, whether it was lip service because he knew what buttons to push with me or not, always said, Wade, I consider you my friend, but you are a journalist first, and you should never let our friendship get in the way of you doing what you think journalistically you should do. Very few people approach me that way. Joe Pedicino, of the Global Wrestling Federation on ESPN, he felt, but I never. When I say they felt betrayed, maybe disappointed or hurt or something's a better way to put it, because I never made promises and broke my word. But I think they thought, because they provided me information and access, that I would not say when I thought a wrestling show was bad that it was bad.
Right.
And it was never on a personal level they felt betrayed, but they felt like maybe they bought extra slack and I didn't give it to them. Even Bill Watts, whose interview with me in the Evolution of Wrestling Summer Annual I talked about, got him his job in WCW. It was the executives at TBS reading that interview led to him getting his job. When I gave a really bad review to his Clash of Champions special and was very down on his booking out of the gate, he called me up and felt betrayed, felt hurt, and read words that I wrote saying, "How can you write something? I thought we had a good relationship." I said, "Yeah, but this was a bad show." So I always felt like my obligation was to my readers to be honest and not have them think I was ever betraying my pact with them to convey what I thought deserved criticism, and not let a friendship get in the way of that. And so I always served my readers more than I did any kind of friendship with people in business. But fortunately, that served me well, because people, even if it was painful sometimes or hurtful, understood that I did stand I stood for something, in other words, and ultimately most people respected me for it.
Yeah, and I think that to look at somebody who has that kind of integrity where, look, most people, especially when you're young and you start getting access, did you ever, especially when you felt competitive, like, look, this is the newsletter game. You're the one who has to get scoops. That's why they're going to pick one newsletter over the other. I mean, some of it will be just in the writing. I prefer this writing style to the other. But at the end of the day, I mean, you're going to need to get information. You're going to need to get scoops. Did you ever worry, okay, look, this was not a good show, but if I trash this show the way I want to trash this show, this information source is going to dry up in the future? Yeah,
and they did. Information sources did go away when they would have been valuable, because I did not. I knew that would happen, and I still said what I said or wrote what I wrote. And it did cost me sources and scoops, and I just put. I'm not trying to say it's like the most important thing in the world, or like I stood above my competitors with more integrity or anything like that. But it just wasn't in my DNA to ever get in that game. Like, I couldn't get in the game of like, well, I need inside information for this person, so I'm going to give them more stars to their match, or bury a controversy that they're involved in, so I can say I covered it, but I didn't draw much attention to it. Like, I won't say to a fault, but to a level that I thought was appropriate. Just said when I thought, Jim Cornette and Smoking My Wrestling was running angles that were drawing upon racist tendencies of parts of his fan base with the gangsters, and it led to there was N-words being thrown around by wrestlers, and a fan riot. 6 police stations were called from the region, and I did a big story on it. And that's when Cornette blew up at me. He felt like I was trying to be too much of a journalist and made too big of a deal out of it. And I interviewed people who were on the scene, including fans, and really did a thorough job on it. Bruce Mitchell, my columnist, who's been a big part of this since 1990, it was very strong in his wording. And it was one of those situations where it blew up a source who could have been, and I agree, Jim Cornette on probably 80% of things politically and wrestling wise, but that's something that ended things with me and him, mutually since then.
Yeah. And I mean, I would imagine if he's leaving racist messages about your family, you're kind of okay with it.
Oh yeah. I mean, he said, don't worry about me getting a gun through an airport, because I'm just going to drive.
That's ridiculous.
And I have it on tape, it's just like stuff like that. And, Cornette's a hothead, and friends of his were like, yeah, he might be serious, he might not. I was like, oh, great.
Yeah.
So yeah, but I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah,
that's
part of the
journey.
game,
Yeah.
right? That's what you signed up for. So, at what point did you notice the game was changing? In the sense that, was it, as the internet came about, I guess the first would be like the hotlines, that the promotions were like, well, if people are making money off of inside information, we'll just do it on the hotlines. But I would imagine that wasn't a giant competitor to you guys. I would think that you specifically, it would be the free websites that would come out and publish information, because to my recollection, and it still goes on today, most of the information that is published on these websites is just lifted from newsletters, right?
Yeah, I think it's less so than it used to be. I do think that there are website reporters now where there's more news being broken by a wider number of people than there has been at any other time, which is good. I want there to be journalism and reporting on wrestling. I don't want, it's not my exclusive domain. I don't want that responsibility, and I don't think it's healthy. So it's less of that than it used to be. But WrestleLine.com was one of the big websites in the late 90s. Wrestling Inc. was the longest running brand, and probably the number one independent website out there right now in terms of traffic and just sheer news content. But WrestleLine was a big one. Let's see, what was Scoops.com, I think was one of them, or something like that. But WrestleLine, the day that I launched PWTorch.com, which was, I think, November 30th or December 1st, 1999. It was one of those 2 dates. And the day that I launched, the main news reporter from WrestleLine said, I no longer serve a purpose, and I'm going to stop doing updates, because now I was reporting news from the Torch hotline and from the Torch newsletter. Now Wade's online, I wouldn't feel right doing it. Like, he was like, the only reason I did is because it was a different medium.
Wow.
And he just stopped doing them. And so, yeah, there came a point, and I say that as a story because early on it was frustrating, because we were breaking news on the 900 line and in the newsletter. And then the websites, sometimes without crediting, and sometimes reporting in summary format, item for item, what was on our hotlines. And Dave Meltzer ran into this too. And there's some names in the wrestling reporting world who did this and who are still around today, and who would take information off the hotlines and report it on their website and not give credit. So it was frustrating, and that's why we ultimately got in the game and realized we've been very busy doing our thing and it's working for us, but we got to enter this newer realm and this newer medium, and it is the future.
Is it frustrating for you now? I mean, with the amount of websites, and you don't strike me as a very negative guy, so maybe you just kind of ignore it, but with the amount of websites and podcasts and YouTube channels and just the amount of sheer content that's out there, the integrity factor that you talked about is growing increasingly and increasingly rare, in the sense that there's not nearly the percentage of people who are reporting on wrestling that are actually out trying to get sourced news versus just copying it from other sources, or copying and pasting and doing it from people who are doing that is small, right? Does it bother you that there are so many that don't kind of have any integrity in this thing?
I was probably more protective of the wrestling journalism genre 15 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I sort of feel like in this social media, anybody can have a website that, as long as Google News, grabs a headline, can get a lot of clicks on a certain day. I sort of feel it's just like out of anybody's hands. Like, I feel like there is just more of a group source environment for news collection and then redistribution. It feels unwieldy and so hard to control at this point that I don't get frustrated. I was going to say I'm resigned to it, but resignation sort of can imply frustration.
Mm-hmm.
But I've sort of just stepped away from worrying about that. I've got my ecosystem. I do what I do. I make a living. I'm proud of the work we do. I've adjusted, hopefully mostly making the right decision and where I put my time and resources. Perhaps I've been either too late or too early, or there's only so much time and resources to do what I do, and I've adjusted over the years as I've done it. And I've sort of just I feel like now there's so many things out there that I can't keep track of, that there's people who have probably been doing their job a long time who I wouldn't know their name, because it's just hard to keep track of that. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I feel like less of a guardian of it, because I just feel like it would be wasted energy. It's too unruly, and there's too many people doing too many things. So I've just sort of lost track of it. But there's moments that I see things that are brought to my attention or run across them when I am reading other sites or hearing what's on other podcasts. And I'm like, oh, I don't like that. But I also think to myself, they probably won't last if that's the way that they're approaching this.
Yeah, I mean, and totally answers my question. I think that's the healthiest way to approach it. I mean, I think in general, if you find people who are successful long term, it's because they really spend their time focusing on what they're doing and making their own product better, as opposed to, worrying about and getting upset over other stuff and competing with that person and trying to one-up that guy. Those are the ones that kind of end up making a big splash in a moment and then fading away pretty quickly after. Yeah,
I mean, we're a lot of weeks the number one current events-based podcast on iTunes until your show drops, and then you're a few spots ahead of us. I'm like, arr. But no, I'm not really. But it's like there's room. The thing is, there's just room for so many. There's room for so many people and so many podcasts, so many websites, and wrestling is popular. And if you do good work, you're going to be rewarded. And the idea that you get that, I don't want like this closed ecosystem of readers who only know that I exist. There's just no way that can happen. It's like MSNBC pretending CNN doesn't exist. It's like, it just does. There's a lot of news sources, and you have to acknowledge that. But it's also healthy that the New York Times and the Washington Post, real journalism with real journalists with this mission and integrity of getting things right and having newsrooms that really, it's not just an opinion with, well, whatever. You can buy into the fake news stuff, but I don't. As far as like real newsrooms, it's healthy that they're competing with each other, but they also are surviving and thriving because most people know it when they see it, when there's an integrity in real journalism and not something that's just an agenda that's masked, an agenda masked by pretending to be news or something like that. So I just think that people end up figuring it out. They figure out where people know what they're talking about, and they seem like they're trustworthy, and that's where they spend their time. So it has a way of kind of working itself out.
Do you ever, or did you ever get to a place where the amount of work that you're doing and the amount of respect that you have for journalism, because it kind of sounds like your passion is journalism before your passion is wrestling. Did you or do you ever get to this place where you are trying to prove to other people in your field that what you're doing has merit and isn't just some goofy wrestling newsletter thing that's a hobby?
Oh, like in the journalism field?
Exactly.
Like outside of wrestling?
Right.
At a time I did. I mean, there was definitely a time when I felt that that was a battle worth fighting, that there was such a thing as that the wrestling industry itself was worthy of journalistic coverage that fell in between the sports page and the variety page. And so because newspapers didn't know how to cover it, and I understand it when you know the evolution of it. I mean, it was a con, and journalists felt like if I try to get information, I'm going to be lied to. This is a sports circus that doesn't have any reason for us to cover it like a sport. But because of the con aspect of it, which was, wrestlers pretending the fights were real and saying, if you don't believe it, I'll beat you up. Come step in the ring. I'll show you how real it is. Journalists just sort of said, okay, we don't care. So there weren't a lot of reasons to cover this weekend TV show that led to once a month live events. Journalism wasn't being done, but there was so much journalism to be done, especially as it went national, got on national TV, became a big money business. But even in the territory days, there were stories to be told that weren't being told. And so, yes, I mean, I fought that battle in the late 80s, early 90s, and really even in the 2000s during the drug I don't want to say drug scandals, but the epidemic of wrestlers who in the late 90s were dying in the 2000s and sometimes in the late 90s because of issues going on in the wrestling industry. That felt like that was a flashing red light for real journalism, and some mainstream publications picked up on it and did stories just like they did in the early 90s when Vince McMahon went on trial for steroid distribution. Mm-hmm. I mean, I was there from speaking of wrestling journalism, or, can wrestling be journalism? I was there in that courtroom from jury selection through closing arguments and covered that trial. And the local New York reporters were coming to me during every break in the trial or at the end of the day going, what did that mean? Was that credible? What, who is this person? Tell me more. And they would use that information as background for their stories. So there have been there have been times where wrestling obviously deserved mainstream wrestling attention, and I did feel like I wanted to, and they'd come to me. I mean, the NPR, the BBC, the cable news stations, they'd come to me in newspapers and say, can we interview you for this? The AP just did last month on the Saudi Arabia crown jewel controversy. So yes, I felt like that, but I don't feel as much like that now because I sort of feel like it's reached a point where it is now.
Right.
Appropriately so.
Right. And that makes sense. Do you have a favorite story that you've broken or reported on over the years?
No, I don't. Like, I'm not even sure, like, in the sense of, it was the most fun or it was the most satisfying in terms of being proud of the coverage in the end, or the most kind of stimulating from a journalism standpoint. I mean, the Vince McMahon trial was fascinating. The rise and fall of Bill Watts in WCW as the savior who didn't work out was fascinating. There's been, the Monday Night War was just crazy. The Bret Hart screw job was, there's been there's a list of 20, 15, 20 stories that are probably relatively interchangeable that had the most just to dive into and feel like your work to talk to people and get to the truth and then dissect and analyze it was at a level different than kind of the week-to-week storyline analysis, which I love. But yeah, the ones that are kind of larger industry-wide stories from a journalism standpoint probably are my favorites. But I mean, I like the week-to-week cycle or grind or cadence of the storylines and the ebb and flow of ratings and business changes and strategies. I mean, I like that too, and that's not really like one singular thing.
I don't know if you even look at it from this perspective at this point, but do you, I don't want to say favorite era because that kind of goes back to being a fan, but I mean, I guess not. Do you have a favorite era or an era in which you think that wrestling was at its best, or is it happening now, or do you have any thoughts on that?
Interesting. No, I don't. Because doing this job for 30 plus years now, it feels like there's, different eras in different ways that I report it. I mean, I think sometimes about how different my job is today than it was, 15 years ago and 20 and 25 years ago. I mean, it's just because of technological changes, I'm not doing there's an aspect of what I do that's the same. And then there's an aspect of it that's entirely different because it's so podcast heavy now. I mean, I still do a paper copy print newsletter in the other room. It's being processed for mailing right now as I record this for you. And my deadline was last night. So I still have that tradition, but my passion now is the podcasting aspect and the fast turnaround time and all of that. And so to me, it's weird, but like when you talk about the favorite era, it's two things are linked. What's happening in wrestling, and then what is my time distribution and technology of covering it. And those two are, to me, indivisible. So like the Vince McMahon trial took place over the course of 3 weeks. And after the first week or the second week, I flew home on a 3-day weekend and did a double issue of the newsletter and then flew back to New York for the rest of the trial while people helping me back here in Minnesota were mailing the newsletter out and getting it mailed. And so now you just sit on your laptop
right
and cover it. But I had to get on a plane to come back to my computer, which was tethered to my desk because it weighed 8,000 pounds and there was no internet, and write up a double issue that updated people who were on the edge of their seat wondering how it was going. And the only way to get them that information was to fly from New York back to Minnesota, write an issue, type it up, send it to the printers. They'd print it. It'd get mailed and distributed. And then while I was back at the trial, people started getting the newsletter in the mail. It's like I don't have a favorite era. It's just like that totally didn't answer your question, but it answered it in a different way how I look at it. But there's absolutely, the short answer is there's times when wrestling is better than it is at other times. But I've never felt like there wasn't good wrestling that I could write about or talk about, but sometimes it wasn't the major promotion. There were times when it absolutely was not even in this country. And some would argue that now. But there's always been good and bad wrestling. Sometimes the ratio is often different.
Well, listen, I mean, you've made a lot of time for us. Clearly, you're a busy guy. You've been running an empire for the last few decades. So it's a bit much, but I appreciate the time. And like you said, you've become super podcast heavy. Your whole PW Torch operation has become super podcast heavy, and I think that is a very, very smart thing to do. Where can people find all of the content that you put out there?
Thank you. Yeah. If people listen this long into it, they might be interested in diving into the history of what I've done. And so I didn't plan this, but I'll just do this. If you haven't taken advantage of a sale for us, like to become a VIP member in the last year, and I didn't plan to do this, but you can just jump on board and see what we're doing for 50 cents.
Oh.
I'll give $9.49. We're normally $9.99 a month. I'll just do a 50-cent sale for the next couple of weeks. If people are listening to the Sam Roberts podcast, go to pwtorchvipinfo.com, pwtorchvipinfo.com. And when you get to the sign up form, just enter SAM50, no space, SAM50. And that will take $9.49 off our normal rate. So for 50 cents, tries for a month. And you can actually go and read the stories I talked about on Bill Watts, Jim Cornette, the Vince McMahon trial double issue. All of that is on our VIP website. And that also unlocks all of our podcasts. I do about 15 per week. And they're ad-free. And there's a bunch of other podcasts with great people too. Some whom my subscribers like a lot more than me. So try it all out. Go to pwtorchvipinfo.com. If you don't want to do that, just check us out. Search Wade Keller on Apple Podcasts or wherever, and the 4 free shows I do per week will pop up, and subscribe to that. And then my website is pwtorch.com, and I'm updating that every day, covering Raw and SmackDown Live and news updates and all that stuff.
It's great stuff, and I love going through the old newsletters. That's my favorite thing, because I didn't have a subscription to the paper newsletters growing up. Like I didn't have that until later. I didn't know about it. I didn't have access to it. It was one of those things where, either you knew or you didn't know. I had, Pro Wrestling Illustrated and the After magazines and stuff like that, but I wasn't a newsletter person. And a lot of this stuff was before the internet. So my favorite thing in the world is to go back to like probably 90 through 95, 96, and just read all this stuff that was before the backstage stories were everywhere. So, like, we don't know. There's no backstage stories about Duke the Dumpster Drosy. There was no websites when he was around. There was no websites when Thurman Sparky Plug was showing up. There was no websites when, like, Earthquake was attacking Hulk Hogan. Like, for me, and it's probably just because of my age and when I became a fan and everything, but going through those newsletters from the early 90s before, the internet boom, when everybody did have access to everything, it's certainly worth 50 cents a month. So I would recommend everybody checking it out. I appreciate you doing that for all the listeners, Wade, and I appreciate you giving us some time today. Thanks, man.
It was fun. I like talking about that stuff, and you asked great questions, so it was a pleasure.
Thanks.
Happy
man.
Thanksgiving.
And you too.
Thank you.